More than 200,000 American citizens just rode out a direct hit from a Category 5 storm, and there's a real chance you never heard about it. Early on a Monday morning in July, the eye of Super Typhoon Bavi passed directly over the island of Rota in the northern Marianas, with peak winds in the eye wall estimated near 180 miles per hour. Meteorologists who track this region closely believe it's the first time a storm of that intensity has ever put its eye directly over that specific island. This is a story that would have led every national newscast for a week if it had happened almost anywhere else in the country, and instead it barely registered outside the region it actually devastated. I want to walk through exactly what happened, how fast this storm actually came together, and why the pattern behind it has climate scientists genuinely concerned. This storm's escalation happened fast enough to catch a lot of people off guard, and understanding that speed matters for understanding everything that followed. What became Bavi started out as an unremarkable tropical storm drifting over warm Pacific water east of Guam in early July. Within days, the Joint Typhoon Warning Center in Hawaii was already flagging it as a system on track to rapidly intensify into a dangerous Category 4 or Category 5 super typhoon. By July 4th, that forecast had already come true. Guam's Homeland Security and Office of Civil Defense confirmed Bavi had rapidly intensified into a full Category 5 super typhoon, with the Joint Typhoon Warning Center's morning bulletin putting maximum sustained winds at 160 miles per hour. A typhoon watch went up across Guam, Rota, Tinian, and Saipan. A flood watch and coastal flood watch followed, and Guam moved into Condition of Readiness 3, the formal threshold at which authorities start actively pushing residents to finish storm preparations. By the following day, the forecast had sharpened into something genuinely alarming. The National Weather Service's Guam office projected Bavi would track directly through the Marianas, as what they specifically called a very dangerous Category 5 super typhoon, with winds by that point estimated at 180 miles per hour and gusts as high as 210. They warned of offshore waves up to 45 feet and 25 to 35 feet along east-facing reefs, a storm surge up to 6 feet stacked with an additional wind-driven surge of as much as 15 feet, and were blunt that catastrophic damage was possible wherever the eye wall actually made contact with land. Roads across Guam emptied out that Sunday as people rushed through final preparations. Plywood sold out island-wide, and businesses boarded up windows ahead of what officials were flatly calling an extremely dangerous, life-threatening situation. Here's the specific detail that pushed this storm into genuinely historic territory. Forecasters had Bavi passing nearest to Rota, a small island sitting between Guam and Saipan and home to roughly 1,500 people, and that's exactly what happened. On Monday morning local time, the eye of Super Typhoon Bavi tracked directly over Rota, sustained winds exceeding 150 miles per hour, peak eye wall winds estimated near 180. Meteorologists who study this region's typhoon history closely say this appears to be the first time on record that a Category 5 intensity system's eye has passed directly over Rota specifically. Local authorities reported major damage on the island almost immediately, though getting a full picture of the extent took time, since the storm had knocked out much of the communications infrastructure needed to assess it. To really understand how extreme that was, it helps to know the region's full track record. Only 12 Category 5 equivalent super typhoons have come within 60 nautical miles of the Mariana Islands on record, period. The strongest direct hit on Guam itself since 1900 was Typhoon Karen in 1962, carrying sustained winds of 170 miles per hour. The strongest direct hit, specifically on Tinian in the northern Marianas, came in 2018 with Super Typhoon U2, which struck at around that same 170 mile per hour mark, killing 2 people, injuring more than 100, and stripping vegetation bare across large sections of both Tinian and Saipan. Bavi's peak eye wall winds, at roughly 180 miles per hour, sit at the very top of that entire historical record. And its direct pass over Rota specifically appears to be genuinely without precedent. The human toll unfolded quickly once the storm actually made landfall. Guam and Saipan both suffered severe power outages as the eye wall and surrounding rain bands pushed through, with flooded roads and storm debris scattered across both islands in the aftermath. Guam's governor, Lou Leon Guerrero, said a complete damage assessment would follow once conditions allowed people to safely move around the island again. Bavi kept tracking west-northwest at around 9 miles per hour after clearing the Marianas, meaning tropical storm conditions actually lingered across parts of the region even after the most violent winds had already moved on, with the National Weather Service estimating the wider system could still drop at least 20 inches of rain across some areas before finally exiting the region. It's worth genuinely sitting with how many people were actually standing in Bavi's path, because it's easy to undersell that number when it's just printed as a statistic. Guam alone is home to roughly 170,000 people. The Northern Mariana Islands, Rota, Tinian, and Saipan combined add another 40,000 or so. All told, That's somewhere around 210,000 American citizens, U.S. territory residents, every one of them, sitting directly in the path of sustained winds equivalent to a major Category 5 hurricane. That's a population on the scale of a mid-sized American city, riding out one of the most intense tropical cyclones on Earth this year, on islands thousands of miles from the mainland with genuinely limited large-scale evacuation options given the underlying geography. There's no driving inland to safety here, the way a resident of a coastal U.S. state might during an approaching hurricane. Evacuation on an island chain in the middle of the Western Pacific typically means moving to a reinforced shelter on the same island, since flying residents out entirely simply isn't realistic for most people in the roughly 48-hour warning window a storm like this actually gives. There's a quieter human dimension to the preparation window that's easy to lose beneath the wind speed statistics. Local reporting out of Guam described nearly empty roads that Sunday as residents worked through last-minute preparations. One small business owner, boarding up windows at her eatery after lining up early Saturday to buy several $100s worth of plywood, put the financial reality plainly. Shutting down for days when her business was already running on thin margins meant losing income she genuinely couldn't spare. That's the kind of unglamorous cost that gets buried underneath storm surge forecasts and wind speed numbers, repeated across thousands of households and small businesses throughout Guam and the Marianas in the days before Bobby actually arrived. It's also worth understanding Guam's broader strategic significance, since it shapes who else has a real stake in how well the island weathers a storm like this. Guam functions as a critical hub for U.S. military forces across the Pacific, with the Department of Defense controlling roughly a third of the island's total land area, including major naval and Air Force installations. That military infrastructure is generally built to a considerably higher structural standard than typical civilian construction, which is part of why Guam has historically avoided the kind of catastrophic casualty counts a storm of Bobby's intensity might otherwise produce elsewhere in the Pacific. It doesn't shield the island's roughly 170,000 civilian residents from extended power outages, flooded roads, and damaged homes, but it's a genuine piece of the broader infrastructure picture that's kept storms like this from becoming even more devastating than they already were. What makes this whole story sting even more is that Bobby wasn't an isolated event for this region this year. Less than 3 months earlier, in mid-April, Super Typhoon Sinlaku had already slammed into the northern Marianas as a powerful Category 4 equivalent storm, with the Joint Typhoon Warning Center estimating landfall winds around 145 miles per hour, as its unusually large eye passed directly over both Tinian and Saipan at once. Sinlaku killed 17 people, caused roughly $1.5 billion in damage, and left 43,000 residents across the Marianas without power. Researchers tracking that storm noted it was the strongest tropical cyclone to form anywhere on the planet in 2026 up to that point, and the strongest system to form specifically in April since Typhoon Surigay back in 2021. For the same roughly 210,000 Americans living across Guam and the northern Marianas, that means writing out 2 separate Category 4 or stronger typhoons inside a single 3-month window, layered on top of Typhoon Mawar's extensive 2023 damage and U2's devastating 2018 strike, both still very much within living memory for a lot of residents. Looking back at U2's 2018 strike in more detail helps put what Bobby did in even sharper focus. U2 hit Saipan and Tinian directly with sustained winds around 175 miles per hour. At the time, the strongest typhoon on record to strike those 2 islands by wind speed. It killed 2 people, injured more than 100, damaged numerous homes and buildings, including Saipan's international airport itself, and stripped vegetation bare across large stretches of both islands. Some residents were reportedly still living in temporary shelters or tents from that 2018 storm years later, when the next major system eventually rolled through the region. Bobby's peak eyewall winds came in even higher than U2's, and its direct pass, specifically over Rota rather than Tinian and Saipan, extended the region's grim record of catastrophic Category 5 strikes to yet another inhabited island in the chain, one that had never previously experienced a storm with its eye passing directly overhead at that kind of intensity. There's a genuinely important climate thread running through this pattern, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than treated as background noise. Researchers tracking global tropical cyclone activity have pointed out that Bobby was the 10th Category 4 or Category 5 tropical cyclone to make a direct hit on a U.S. state or territory within the past decade, a total that matches every Cat 4 and Cat 5 landfall the entire United States experienced across the previous 57 years. Combined, that's not a subtle statistical wobble. It's a genuine compression of what used to be a once-in-a-generation kind of event into something now happening on close to an annual basis somewhere across U.S. territory. The physical explanation researchers point to centers on warming ocean temperatures, raising what's called the maximum potential intensity of a tropical cyclone, essentially the theoretical ceiling on how strong a storm forming over a given stretch of ocean can actually become. Warmer water hands a developing storm more energy to work with. And Bovie formed and intensified over western Pacific waters, running exceptionally warm this year. A pattern this year's strengthening El Niño has further reinforced, tending to shift and enhance typhoon activity specifically toward the Marianas. Guam and the northern Mariana Islands get struck by tropical storms or typhoons somewhere between 6 and 7 times in an average year. And the broader region they sit within, the northwestern Pacific, is the single most active tropical cyclone zone on the entire planet, producing roughly 25 to 26 tropical storms in a typical year, about 16 of which become full typhoons. That's substantially more storm activity than the entire Atlantic hurricane basin produces in a normal season. For the roughly 210,000 Americans living across these islands, that baseline exposure simply is life. What's actually shifted, based on the data researchers have been tracking closely, isn't overall storm frequency. It's the growing frequency of storms specifically reaching Category 4 and Category 5 intensity, the exact kind of storm capable of doing what Bovie did to Rhoda that Monday morning. After clearing the Marianas, Bovie kept tracking west-northwest, weakening only gradually as it crossed less favorable water, and went on to threaten Taiwan and parts of eastern China later that same week, still carrying typhoon-force winds, even after everything it had already inflicted on Guam and the northern Marianas days earlier. For the islands directly in its initial path, the storm moving on didn't mean the story was over. Recovering from a direct Category 5 strike layered on top of a Category 4 strike just 3 months before is a process measured in months and years, not days. The same reinforced concrete buildings that helped limit the casualty count still need real structural repair. The same power grids need real rebuilding. And the same roughly 210,000 Americans are the ones actually living through that recovery, largely outside the notice of most of the rest of the country. That's really the through line worth sitting with here. A storm this powerful, striking this many American citizens directly, would dominate national headlines for days if it happened almost anywhere else in the country. Guam and the northern Mariana Islands sit roughly 6,000 miles from Washington, D.C., separated from the mainland by an entire ocean, and, for a lot of Americans, by a genuine gap in basic awareness that these islands are U.S. territory populated by U.S. citizens at all. None of that distance makes the wind any less real, the flooding any less destructive, or the recovery ahead any less difficult for the people actually living through it right now. It just means this kind of story usually has to be sought out rather than arriving on its own. I'll be tracking how the rest of this year's Western Pacific typhoon season develops, especially given how active it's already been, and I'll bring you an update the moment anything else this significant comes together. If you want to stay informed about storms like this one, the kind that hit American citizens without necessarily making it into the national conversation, subscribe now.